chair of the DE&I Programming Subcommittee. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. The discussion is being recorded and will be available at a later date. Our comments or our own should not be publicized without permission, should not be construed as legal advice, and do not represent the positions of our companies, clients, or the chapter. The discussion is technology facilitated. Please direct your attention to a few features that will help you enjoy and participate in today's program. For question and answers, Q&A, please use the chat feature. We want this conversation to be interactive, but it can be difficult to chime in or ask a question orally on video conference. If you have a question or comment, feel free to ask using the chat button located at the bottom of your screen. All participants and panelists will be able to view questions. If speakers are unable to get to your question, please feel free to contact John Lewis after this program. Everyone is on mute by default to minimize echoes and background noise. If you would like to speak, you'll need to unmute yourself to speak. Once you're finished speaking, please place yourself back on mute to minimize background noise. Rhonda and I will now introduce our session hosts. John Lewis Jr. is a partner and co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Shook, Hardy & Bacon. He has more than 25 years of broad-based experience as a trial lawyer in private practice and as in-house counsel litigation and compliance counsel. He focuses his practice on internal and government investigations. Jennifer De Jesus Roberts is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Booz Allen Hamilton. In this role, Jennifer leads the firm's litigation, investigations, and legal operations teams. She is the executive sponsor of the firm's Latin American network, serves as a DEI champion for the legal, ethics, and compliance teams, and is leading the legal team's efforts to obtain Mansfield Rule certification. Over the course of her career, in addition to her experience and background in litigation and government and internal investigations, Jennifer had the good fortune to work closely in partnership with top executives at a variety of Fortune 500 companies in matters involving corporate compliance and ethics programs, corporate and business transactions, and enterprise risk management issues. Her experiences both in-house and in private practice gives her an informed perspective and a keen appreciation for the need for flexibility and creativity in legal analyses to allow for the appropriate balance of compliance risk with the business needs of an organization.
Thank you, Veronique. Naomi Mercer is Senior Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the American Bankers Association and my colleague. She transitioned from a military career where she served as an assistant professor in the Department of English and Philosophy at the United States Military Academy and in the Pentagon running the Army's Gender Integration and Religious Accommodation programs. Her educational background includes a doctorate in literary studies with a minor in gender and women's studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and an executive certificate in strategic diversity and inclusion from Georgetown University's Institute for Transformational Leadership. She is the author of the academic monograph, Toward Utopia. Thank you all for joining us today and leading us in this very important discussion and continuation of our August program on implicit bias. John, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rhonda, and good afternoon, everyone. As has been stated previously, it's always nice when you're invited to speak somewhere and then there's a subsequent invitation to come back again. So I'm certainly gratified that so many of you found the conversation helpful and wanted to continue it. I'm pleased to be back. I'm delighted to have been invited by ACC NCR for the continuation of this conversation about implicit bias. I am particularly excited because, as you can no doubt imagine, this has sort of been the high season for folks who are students of these diversity and inclusion related topics in terms of speaking opportunities and opportunities to roundtable and benchmark and best practice share So I have given the talk that you heard in August, the implicit bias talk, is one that I've given a number of times. However, this is actually the very first time that I've been asked to come back and participate in a conversation about the next step, which is the debiasing conversation. So I'm excited. You guys are sort of the first audience for some of the content that we've pulled together. I'm particularly excited to be working with Jennifer and Naomi. Jennifer's litigation background and work with major companies has made her uniquely qualified and sort of oriented to think about this. Having done a good bit of litigation for most of my career, we know that the decision making around everything from hiring and retention to picking juries, all sort of involves us being mindful that bias is not informing that decision making. In fact, a lot of the content that came out of the original presentation, as I think I told you all, actually came from a toolkit developed by the American Bar Association litigation section. So this is a topic that has been top of mind for the bar, top of mind for litigators, and so it's great to have that perspective. Also fascinating, honestly, to me is Naomi's military background. My dad joined the Navy 7 years after President Truman signed his executive order integrating the armed services. And it has always seemed to me that the military has been one step ahead of civilian society in sort of wrestling with and addressing these issues of how folks of all backgrounds and stripes are able to not just come into the military, but to move up and to move into positions of leadership. So I think there's a lot for us to learn from what our military and with those who have instructed and trained the leaders of our military, like Naomi has done. So I expect and excited that this will be a great conversation. So today's session, you will note, has been named a debiasing roundtable. And that's important because the use of the word roundtable was intentional. Whereas our last presentation was really more of a sort of TED Talk orientation and sort of familiarization with these topics, the notion of a roundtable presupposes that we are, as colleagues, sitting around a virtual roundtable somewhere, really strategizing and thinking tactically about how we address these bias questions in our midst. So, so in the spirit of the comments that were made earlier, this is a conversation which, by its nature, is interactive, and is one that that allows us to sit around and share practices and strategies that have worked, such that we can begin to kind of divine some idea about how to debias. There is no blueprint for this. There is no sort of set of actionable steps that, if taken, will guarantee that you will debias your organization. This is very much tradecraft for all of us. But in that spirit, hopefully today's session will give you a nugget or two or three that you can take back to your organizations that begin to allow you to, or enable you to have this conversation about biasing. Right now, we're moving away from sort of framing this question a bit and really now in sort of a tabletop dynamic, thinking more tactically about solutions and strategies and tools. So this is, as I said, a different conversation from the one that those of you who were here in August heard. Also important to mention that the ACC folks, in preparation for and sort of at the conclusion of this session, have prepared a great set of written takeaways for you. One is a debiasing summary that I think at a high level will talk about some of the concepts that we'll introduce here. And the other is a template that can be used as a personal or team debiasing action plan. The old adage, what gets written gets done. And I am a big believer of refrigerator magnets and notes to myself about the things that I want to constantly reinforce as I kind of begin a day. So it's really in that spirit that you've got this this action plan that is intentionally not being completed because you know your organization, you know your own personal sensibility about these topics, and And that is why, in many respects, each of us will have to kind of be the architect of our own debiasing plan. But I think this was a great tool, one I've not seen. So kudos to the idea of really bringing that forward as a way for you to kind of take away and continue this conversation. What I'll do for the next 5-10 minutes or so, and then invite Naomi and Jennifer to join the conversation, is that this is, in as much as this is a continuation of a conversation that we had back in August, and without assuming that everybody who is on today was on in August, I thought it might be helpful to do a quick flyover of what we discussed in August and sort of refresh for some and introduce for others kind of some working definitions of these concepts. Of course, the first concept that needs some definition is the notion of implicit bias itself. And for those of you who were there, you may remember that I described implicit bias, and I think the working definition of implicit bias is really the multitude of day-to-day decisions and actions and reactions that come from what psychologists call pre-reflective attribution, which is a psychologist's way of saying implicit first order awareness, the things that we do before our cognitive capabilities sort of kick in full force, of particular qualities. So we've got a multitude of interactions, pre-reflexive attribution of particular qualities by an individual that are then extrapolated, that are contributed to a group. And I think the example I used last time is in its barest sense, it is a view that, well, years ago, a Chinese guy stole my wallet. So now I believe that you got to watch out for Chinese guys or they're going to steal your wallet. That's me taking a pre-reflexive attribution of particular qualities that I've observed in one person, and then taking those qualities and sort of applying them to an entire group of people. And unfortunately, the way that this works, the way that this implicit bias works, as I said, in the multitude of decisions and the multitude of actions and all of the words that are said, it is inevitable that some of that implicit bias creeps in. The New York Times, of course, called it fast thinking discrimination. It is that reflexive thinking. The New York Times years ago had done a study, as you may remember, on sort of this discrimination in the rental market, the residential rental market, and how folks were treated when they went to rent flats or brownstones or what have you, and found that, the discrimination happened because there were certain sets of assumptions that the people who were leasing these properties made about people who came up. Taxi cabs, there are a whole host of these that I would invite to your attention if you're interested in more reading about them. But fast thinking discrimination. The other thing we talked about back in August was that we all have these biases. This is not an intentional sort of racist or sexist or xenophobic thing. Our biases are sort of one of the things that define us as human beings, but they insert themselves and if left unchecked, can kind of skew the work that we do, particularly the work we do as lawyers, because a lot of it involves judgment and a lot of it involves sort of thinking about what we think we know about circumstances and people, about picking jurors, about the bias of folks who are on the bench, about the bias in terms of how we deal with talent decisions in our organization. As was mentioned earlier in the introduction, I've spent most of my career as an in-house lawyer, and now as a partner in a law firm. I do workplace investigations, and I will tell you that a lot of what comes out of workplace investigations and internal investigations are instances where usually the party complained on has engaged in some conduct, rarely intentional, that has caused someone in that person's midst to feel as though they are not being treated fairly. So it's a lot of lost in translation. It's a lot of two ships in the night. But when you tear it apart, a lot of it sort of travels upon this highway of these biases that happen. So the biases are not just a cultural nice to have, or debiasing is not a cultural nice to have. Biases actually get in the way of the work that we do as lawyers. I mean, I think fundamentally. I was my company's, after lead litigation, I was my company's chief diversity officer for a period of time. and remembered a conversation with a woman named Karen Tornite, who was my counterpart at our auditor, E&Y. And Karen and I were chatting about sort of implicit bias training. And she said, I said, well, she said, how many people in your organization and how are you guys rolling out implicit bias training? And I answered the question. And I asked her, I said, well, what are you doing? She says, well, everybody who is a people manager, including the leads of audit teams, go through implicit bias training. And I thought, well, that's a cultural nice to have. And she said, no, John, it's not a cultural nice to have. People who are not aware of their own implicit biases miss stuff in audits. So there, to me, was this sort of moment where it was obvious that not only was bias corrosive to culture and antithetical to employee engagement and created all these risks, it actually was at some level subverting the actual work that was being done. So this is important work because it really goes to the stem of what we do as lawyers. So I talked about the objectives in my first presentation, and I just review those very quickly. The first is that we talked about how biases may insert themselves or embed themselves in the work that we do. And again, was a very deliberate choice of words, because may implies that it's a choice that we make. It's a choice that we make either to understand or not to seek to understand where biases have sort of crept into our business. That this is not explicit bias. Explicit bias, of course, is obvious and typically intentional. Again, in these workplace investigations, you don't typically find the intentional bad actor. You find somebody who said something in a meeting, or you find somebody who made some assumptions about who the right person was for the next role, but not in an intentional, malevolent way, but just operating on some other way. So these implicit biases, they're not always obvious. They're rarely intentional. But when they migrate from thoughts in our head to actual behaviors, particularly where we are leaders in our organization, we then get across the transom from what appears to be prejudiced decision-making. And of course, all discrimination is prejudice, the mental construct of prejudice that moves into a behavioral realm. So we also talked about, in as much as biasing in some respect is sort of an intentional thing or a thing that we allow to happen, we've also got to be equally intentional about how we go about debiasing. We have to be, you've heard people talk about being not just I'm not racist, being actively anti-racist. And that's a bit of what this work requires of it. It requires of us to think about how we act intentionally and how we act as leaders and how we act in this space. We talked a little about in-groups and out-groups. You may remember the conversation about, in the 20th century, diversity conversations were really more about antipathy to some other group. I don't like those people. I don't like those kind of people. I don't like people from that place. I don't like people of this religion. I used to say, we don't see very much of that anymore. Sadly, we've seen more of it than we would like. But most of what we see in the spaces where we are is not so much out-group hostility, but more in-group affinity. That's the old, John reminds me of me at that age. That folks naturally militate toward affinity and affinity connections, and they're more comfortable with people more like them. And there's nothing inherently sinister or bad about that. But when it begins to act to close off opportunities for folks that don't fit in that affinity set, that's when we begin to see bias creep in and sort of insert itself and attach itself. We talked a bit about cultural groups and these 5 cultural groups and how the work of identifying one's own sort of cultural group begins to help us root out where affinity bias may come. The circle exercise that I told you guys about, and maybe some of you did it in your offices, has always been fascinating to me, is that it brings out to a more conscious level a lot of these automatic associations that we make. And they're all throughout our midst. They're in our political discourse, they're in our sort of social discourse. We've now come to understand that words like inner city and crime and all this. Others have become a surrogate in a lot of ways for the Black community and the Latino community. So listening for the buzzwords that begin to trigger in folks reactions that suggest that we are someplace other than in an unbiased space is important. We talked about schemas and this whole idea, these mental constructs. They really are sort of origins of child psychology that create mechanisms for us to think about large amounts of data and categorize large amounts of data, and how the unconscious mind is what deals with the mundane. So when we talk about something is like riding a bike, or when we talk about, you know, how none of us had to be retaught how to tie our shoes once we tied them in the first place, that's the mental construct. That's the schema at work, not requiring us to sort of consume precious conscious mental energy to do some of these mundane tasks. But what if police have relegated to their unconscious mind a construct about a Black motorist? What if folks in HR or folks performing talent reviews have relegated to their unconscious minds decisions about who is best positioned for the next role? So this is sort of where this work comes from, and the origins of the work, from the cultural groups that we're members of, from the schemas that we have embedded in us, from the trusted sources, and what we know based on something that is called appropriately enough confirmation bias, is that these biases strengthen over time. In fact, we go out consciously looking for affirmation of the biases that we hold, rather than actively pushing to try to root the biases out. Finally, we talked a little bit about microaggressions, and microaggressions, of course, are these subtle indignities that we see really everywhere around us, that usually ironically intended as compliments, but manifest themselves as really sort of hurtful, injurious, particularly corrosive in the workplace. I recall being a young lawyer, in trial practice in the Midwest in my early days, and occasionally having my opposing counsel, ironically, a lot of times a person I had defeated in court, come up and tell me how articulate I was. Microaggressions, sort of, again, intending to be helpful, but ultimately suggesting that the fact that I was a capable lawyer might have been a bit of a surprise to them. So that in a 30,000 foot level is really what we talked about the last time, and hopefully it sets the table a bit for where we are. Kasha, let's move to the next slide. So part of that ABA work that I talked about embedded work by Professor Kang that has been called in a shorthand the Kang primer. And the good news about debiasing is, as Professor Kang notes, is that motivation makes a big difference in your ability to debias. Wanting to be better at this is actually very important. What the Kang study was a report commissioned by the National Center of State Courts in 2009. And it really sort of tore apart this kind of core construct of debiasing work that leverages and always asks for decisions grounded in data, as opposed to decisions grounded in intuition or what somebody believes they already know. One of the examples that he gave that I thought made a lot of good sense was, he said, don't tell me how much you weigh, just get on the scale. In the one instance, we are making, and so all of the biases about how a person maybe perceives, maybe how somebody else perceives, there are a host of other reasons. But if we use objective data as a basis to kind of get to what the decision is, then we are more likely to have gotten to and again, we never completely debias, but we're more likely to get to a decision that is as bias-free as we can make it. But it requires a couple things of us, and this is where we launch into this conversation. The first thing it requires is that we acknowledge what every academician and clinician who has studied this question has known to be true. That is that the first thing we have to do in order to debias is to acknowledge that bias is real, and that we all have it, and that I have implicit biases, and that everybody here has, by virtue of those trusted sources and by virtue of those cultural groups and by virtue of those schemas, all of us have within us the propensity, if left unchecked, to engage in decision making and worst, action upon decision making that may be biased. So we've got to first have acknowledgement, and then we have to have belief that our bias is actually a problem. That the things that we believe and the ways that we have actioned and the decisions that we have made and the things that we have said and the things that as a leader we have perhaps allowed to be said, in team space or in our workplaces, that all those things are a problem, that they have a corrosive effect on engagement of our employees. They demotivate, and because they demotivate, we have sort of crippled the ability to be optimally high-performing teams at work, and they have all sorts of other carry-on consequences that we may or may not find helpful in our workplace. Next slide, please. So we gave you a working definition of what it means, of what implicit bias means. So, fair being fair, we thought we'd also give you a construct, one idea or one elemental way to think about what debiasing is. And what's important to take away from this slide is that the first thing you should know about debiasing is that it's not an event. We don't sort of emerge from a session or from a training or even a moment of reflection or self-examination successfully and sufficiently debiased. It's a process. It's an ongoing process that requires us to continuously test and challenge things that we believe and that we hear, and use that process in an ongoing way to continue to get better at this. To reduce the influence of cognitive biases. Now, note that doesn't say to eliminate the influence of these biases. Our best and highest aspiration here is to, and again, I'm remiss to use examples about this pandemic, but what the epidemiologists are saying to us is that some version of a coronavirus will probably likely be with us for some time. So what we are doing in sort of the epidemiological abatement is that we're not eliminating. We've not sort of told ourselves that we're going to eliminate the virus, but we can reduce its influence and its impact, and we can take certain steps to remediate and minimize the impact. And that's what we're talking about here: debiasing as a way to reduce these cognitive biases. And then finally, giving people a construct to think about this in a rational, optimal way, as opposed to a visceral, sort of emotional way. And these topics are typically emotional. Next slide. So this is a slide that you may remember from the last presentation. This was sort of the jumping off point. I think it was probably the end of the hour. And we talked very quickly about really these sort of pillars of a debiasing strategy. The first is education. What we begin to learn about each other that then becomes at odds with what we thought we knew about each other is the beginning of this process. Again, with mindfulness, again, with awareness that bias, we wear masks because we are aware that coronavirus is in our midst. So in that same way, but because we obviously can't remediate, we can't stop, we can't protect ourselves unless we first acknowledge that there's something there. And the same is true with the debiasing exercise. We have to believe that this is a thing. And we had this raging debate, I don't know how raging a debate it was last year, about the pervasiveness of racism, for example. And you may remember that the choke point of that conversation in a lot of ways was a difference of opinion about whether racism was a thing, remarkably. So in the same way, we've got to decide here, and we've got to all stipulate, since we're all lawyers, that debiasing is a thing and that all of us have it, and that it takes some intentionality to be mindful about how it goes. The next piece here, exposure, contact, that's leaving those affinity groups, that's leaving those sort of trusted sources and beginning to populate our thinking in the corridors and places where we haven't been before. And then finally, what's our approach? If this is fast thinking, if biases come about as a result of fast thinking decision making, then reducing cognitive load, thinking more slowly, as Gladwell said, stare, don't blink. But really engaging in a higher level of processing about this by writing things out, by embedding organizational and structural tools that give us the ability to root this out in real time, so that it doesn't have that distracting impact on our workplaces and on ourselves. Next slide. So so the debiasing process, and where we'll spend the balance of the time, is really kind of stepping through this. And I want to invite Jennifer and Naomi to kind of begin this part of the roundtable conversation, really talking about and giving us sort of a sense of how we go about in a process-driven way to really work on and think about these biases. And again, 6 steps: awareness building. Based upon that awareness, what decisions do we make? Importantly, what decisions do we make that are different? Analysis. The antidote to visceral shooting from the hip decision making is some more thoughtful analysis about the decisions that we make. And we're all oriented to do that. We're oriented in our companies and our firms to do that. There is a ton of analytical rigor that attends the work we do as lawyers. And so we add this to that pile of analytical rigor as we begin to think about this. And then being planful as opposed to reactive. By the time you've hired me to come in and do a workplace investigation, we're probably more on the reactive side of a concern that is percolated, that if vetted and talked about and discussed and analyzed and awareness built around, might have been obviated. The actions that we take, the things that we do deliberately, those things, to my example, that we write on Post-it notes and stick to our refrigerators, those are the personal actions and accountabilities that lead us to debiasing. And then again, because this is not an event, because it's an ongoing thing, whether you practice yoga or play golf badly as I do, we know that ongoing assessment, ongoing rigor, ongoing determination about this is what we have to begin to sort of embed into our daily routine. So those are really the 6 steps that we are going to talk about as a way to begin to kind of to channel through this conversation. So next slide, please. So in the spirit of a tabletop discussion, what we thought we would do is just sort of throw questions on the table. You were encouraged to be interactive here, and we hope that you will. Naomi and Jennifer and I really view ourselves as more as conversation leaders here. But the first piece of awareness is to think about when bias has been triggered, to think critically about the culture of the place where you work and what those biases are. I can tell you one of the, and all biases aren't bad. We don't mean to make them sound bad, but I'll tell you one of the things that's sort of my old company and candidly my firm is that there is a bias toward longevity. There's a bias toward having been here and worked here a long time. In fact, when you talk to people, the first thing they tell you is that my name is John and I've been here 32 years. And maybe that's true of your culture as well. And so the question then becomes, well, where might we root out a bias or an implicit bias that is informed by a cultural norm that values or maybe overvalues longevity and long tenure in a particular place? It was all over the place at my old company. And so this is how we begin to build awareness. We begin to ask, how has that bias kind of become pulled in? And then how does the bias affect you? How has it affected you? If you're not long tenured at my old company, it's probably affected you in some narrowing of opportunity for you in the short run. How does it affect your decision making? And what biases are apparent to your colleagues? Now, that's one of the places where awareness is built, because the truth is we don't know how things affect our colleagues unless we talk to them. I have spent most of the last week in one of these workplace investigations, and it was an investigation into, words by a person who was senior in this organization, who will be stunned to know how his words have landed with folks in his midst, and no indication that he did it intentionally or said things intentionally. But the truth of the matter is, we have got to be deliberate and intentional about how we go about rooting out and understanding how biases and norms have affected people in our midst. Naomi, Jennifer, anything there?
Sure. Thanks, John. I was going to say that usually you can tell that a bias has been triggered when you have that inner monologue. And it's a statement that sometimes goes like, they always do X, or they never are Y, right? And so you have to interrogate that statement, because that's a generalization, that's a bias, right? Who's the they? Who's the they that we're talking about? And you have to define that group. And then you also have to examine that word of absolute, the always, the never. Is that really true? It's almost always never true, right? And usually when I feel my own biases are being triggered, I'm usually in a situation where I'm feeling a certain level of frustration, right? And so I have to ask myself, what's really going on here? Am I hungry? Am I dehydrated? Am I just tired? Or am I just frustrated? And that's one way to start examining that trigger and to kind of bring you out of the moment so that you don't act on that bias.
No, that's great. And as you said that, Naomi, I actually thought about, I think we've all seen that one candy bar commercial where the person starts off being very grumpy and grouchy, and then they eat the candy bar and they realize they were hungry, and it's a different person. But it's a great point that certainly there are words that should sort of raise your antenna in the workplace, to raise your antenna anywhere, frankly, and surely never and always, or everybody, or they always, or tend to be, without any examination, objectively not correct. Jennifer.
Now, that's really insightful, Naomi. I think you took the words out of my mouth in terms of when the bias has already been triggered. Maybe I can move on to some of the other questions here.
Sure.
It's interesting because I do value, being a woman of color, right? I identify as Black, I identify as Latina, I identify as a woman, so I hit a number of categories. I try to be very aware of my biases. As we were going through this exercise, I was thinking, well, what biases kind of do I bring? And are there ones that have been apparent to my colleagues, but not apparent to me? And I would share, and maybe this resonates with a number of the participants on the call as well, but it's this, I guess it's the past performance bias, right? When someone does really great work for me, then I think that everything is really great that they do, and they're going to produce it. And boy, John knocked it out of the ballpark, last time, and John's going to continue to knock it down. And I have a tendency to almost put someone into that, great performer or bad performer bucket, and, needing to break through that and being very introspective and realizing that, what, if a colleague says, no, this memo wasn't very good, or this wasn't that good, that I have to be really thoughtful of, that maybe maybe we are seeing a decline, maybe it is. And sometimes that takes me longer, I think, than most. I don't know if other folks can resonate, or if that resonates with others. But that's one example. Another example, and this may go to kind of the like me bias, I think, John, you used in your prior presentations on this, right, is I had worked for years. So my background is both in-house, but also in private practice, much like John. And for years, I worked with this amazing associate, phenomenal. She was one of the best lawyers that I still know and hold out today. And she decided to move on or not move on, take a break and have a family. And when she came back from her family leave, and I think the world of this associate, and maybe it's in my past performance bias, I put her in the, she can do no wrong. But I wasn't giving her as much work. And in my mind, I was not giving her, as much work as I wanted to, because I wanted her to go home to her baby, to spend time with the family, to enjoy this new first year of motherhood. And it took my colleagues coming to me and saying, like, have you had a falling out? Like, what's going on? What's going on for it to be, it's this, I thought it was like me, because when, I have 2 kids of my own. And when they were young, I really wanted to have a very clear delineation as to the hours that I worked and when I wouldn't. And it was just fascinating how my colleagues and they had to flag that for me, right? That I had this bias going on as to her and her exceptional, capable work. And then she came to me and we had it out, and I gave her, John, you can appreciate this, but back to the law firm days, she got all the work that she wanted. Moving on. But it's interesting, how
Careful what you ask for, huh?
That's right. That's right. But those biases kind of go and work in. And again, I do try to consider myself fairly introspective in trying to monitor that. But those were just some that I noticed here. And I'm curious as to if we've gotten anything in the chat here about.
Yeah, no, we're getting some comments in the chat. But Jennifer, it's a great point, and I will tell you, I having sat in talent reviews at the company. You hear it. People are well intentioned. Well, is it really safe for a young woman, general manager to go to that country, which is, I guess, a person coming from a well-intentioned place, but maybe before we sort of eliminate her in absentia, maybe we should ask her if she wants to go to Istanbul. Maybe we should ask her if she wants to do something else. Right. The other bit is that you would invariably hear people talk about the career trajectories of women in the construct of, well, she's a young mother, how will that affect her? But we would never ask, I was a young father, nobody ever asked me, what about the kids? So you've got folks who, again, most of the damage is done in this space when people are trying to be helpful. And so you have to kind of give people a bit of forgiveness, but kudos to your colleagues for kind of calling it out. Because the other thing that this requires is kind of a trusted workspace, right? Where people aren't trying to throw you under a bus. They're just pulling you aside and say, hey, did you realize in that meeting, that, this is kind of what you said, and this is kind of maybe how it came across. And but that's it's really the only way that you can have an authentic conversation about this in the workplace in a way that's not threatening to folks.
Well, and I want to give a label to that phenomenon where people assume that, oh, a new mom doesn't want to travel or needs a reduced workload. It's called benevolent paternalism, just so that we all, can keep that in mind. And then when we see it, we can put a name to it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I had not heard benevolent paternalism, but it makes good sense. And that's invariably, but what's happening is that, in my old company, these were men who'd come into the workplace at a certain point in history, who had a certain mental construct about sort of who breadwinners were and all this other, and invariably that creeps into decision making. And so in order to sort of root it out, we have to give each other license to kind of talk about it openly. A couple things from the chat, and then we'll move on. First comment. Let me get up here. What would that be implicit bias or disparate impact? The later still needs to be addressed, but the generation of each is slightly different. Yeah, I mean, the way that I sort of think about that is implicit bias is really sort of a mental construct, right? It's not anything that we have sort of acted upon at this point. We just sort of have in our heads that, young women shouldn't go to dangerous countries. When that becomes operationalized, when that becomes sort of turned into an action or turned into a decision, that is where I think this impact, and that is where discrimination, and that's where these other things come from. So again, having handled race cases, gender cases, all manner of discrimination claims, nationality, national origin, I didn't get the job because I had an accent. Invariably, the irony is that the doer of the bad deed typically thought that he or she was doing a good thing. And of course, that's not really how it landed with the hearer or the person who's on the receiving end of that thing. So yeah, a different thing. I mean, once we get, and of course, this is sort of risk management as well. You hope to sort of keep all these things in that sort of implicit bias space, because once they sort of metastasize into actual actions that the organization is taking, then you begin to introduce these other legal and reputational and operational risks. Let's see, the second one, I hadn't fully connected. I know I tend to be less forgiving and assume the worst rather than the best when I'm hungry. Yeah, it's not just me. Knowing that there's a trigger to help awareness with the biases. Yeah, we bring our whole selves to work, and we bring our grumpiness, we bring our insecurities, we bring our preconceptions. And this is just sort of having a higher level of awareness about it. I mean, if you think about the Goldman work from Harvard Business School, the emotional intelligence work, that that two of those dimensions are self-awareness and empathy. And self-awareness is this ability that we have to teach ourselves to say, hey, why do I think that? Or why did I presume this person? Or why did I presume this person would want to do that? And then the empathy is to really sort of translate into the perspective of the hearer as we evaluate the things that we have said. All right, are we ready to move on here? Next slide, Kasia, please. So decision making. So once we've sort of kind of crossed the Rubicon of everybody's now gotten awareness about this, then there's some decisions to make. What actions do I need to take myself to debias? Or as a leader, what role do I have to set the requisite tone on my team to sort of root out biases and begin to understand? And what actions do we need to stop taking? What are we doing now, though well-intentioned, that may be working at cross purposes with our efforts to debias? The things that, in my own sort of self-examination is really to sort of leave my own cultural space. I mean, I went to law school up there in DC at GW. And I remember spending a lot of time with my fellow Black law students, the fistful of us. Maybe I should have, or maybe somebody would have coached me to sort of branch out of my own tribe and begin to kind of understand and learn the perspectives of other folks, or learn what I thought I knew but didn't know about, about people in other spaces. So that's part of the education process. As a leader, making sure that voices are heard, making sure that there's a constant loop, this virtuous loop of 360 feedback, so that we know that people don't leave meetings feeling diminished or feeling marginalized or feeling like they've been the target of a microaggression. Having those conversations and being very deliberate and very intentional as a leader, and speaking on those things, giving those things real estate in your weekly team meetings to say, just a reminder that, if you see something, I'd like for you to say something. I'd like for you, if you see something, if you observe something in me, I'd like for you to call it out, because I'm here. I'm never going to be perfect, but I am here trying to be better. And I think you give people that license to give you feedback, and you establish accountabilities. These are actionable decisions that kind of move it forward. Naomi, Jennifer.
So, John, I want to echo what you said about, getting out of your cultural space. The number one thing that you can do is to start having contact or more contact with people who are not like you.
Yeah.
In whatever way you have those biases, you need to have contact with those groups, because then you start to see them as individuals and not the monolith and not the stereotype. So it's a matter of getting out of your bubble. The self-education and self-reflection are also very key components about debiasing yourself. You can do this through perspective taking, which is what you can use literature to help you do, by reading books about people who are not like you, or by authors who are not like you. But I think that reflection piece is always very, very important. It's like, are my biases and my actions and my behaviors that are driven by those biases, are they in line with my values? And to think about those. So that you can start to recognize when your behavior doesn't match those values.
Absolutely.
I want to echo everything that that you both have said in this space. You know, one of the things that I do try to do with my teams and have historically tried to do, because it's just, I don't know that I could foot stomp enough, you know, the value in just asking questions, right? John, you can appreciate this in our role in litigation and investigations, right? Many times we have either our colleagues, our associates, our, you know, counsel that we're working with making these credibility determinations, right? Well, how do you know that they're credible? You know, how are you getting to that? And asking those questions and trying to get to the most simple explanation as you know, not in the outright, they lied to me, the document said this, they told me that, right? But it's when we're trying to get that overall sense of just, do we find this person credible? How will they hold up on the stand, right? How will they hold up in a deposition? It's just really trying to get to the rationale, and is there some sort of bias in that, as we're trying to think through how we're getting to that conclusion that we're trying to draw, which has just been fascinating to me as a, you know, from a team dynamic, and then again blending this debiasing into like real life, real world decisions that we face in our profession, and how we make those assessments.
No, it's a great point, Jennifer. I was years ago involved in an FCPA training in Nigeria. Now, I hate to break the news to you all, but there are a few implicit biases about Nigerians. And I just kind of confronted them head on and wanted to understand. I said, why, you know, help me understand. This was our business leader there, you know, bright young guy, had MBA from Emory, and I said, help me understand sort of what the real answer is, and help me understand why people have come to believe where they are. And the answer that I got gave me a good bit of enlightenment, and I think it helped me deliver a more effective presentation, understanding some of the cultural underlay for places, particularly places, you know, how you would do this, Jennifer will tell you, in Brazil is different from how you would do it in Shanghai, is how different from how you would do it in Lagos. And so a lot of this sort of raising, I remember one of my old bosses used to talk about raising your cultural intelligence, understanding a bit more of the cultural nuance and some of the folks that you interact with, such that you can be more effective in the roles that you are. And that's what we do all day long, Jennifer, right? We make value judgments about people. We assess credibility. We assess the credibility of witnesses. We think about sort of people in terms of effectiveness as witnesses. And all of that stuff is just, it is fertile soil for bias to creep in.
Well, and I would also touch on, you know, the leadership part of that team building is essential. And, you know, as Jennifer said, the being curious and asking questions, you know, with a genuine interest can help, particularly leaders bring their teams, you know, closer together. And being able to have those uncomfortable conversations on a variety of topics, you know, or even current events that happen, that can really help the group come to a different understanding of each other and what biases they may have.
Good. No, I mean, steering people toward fact-based conversations has gotten exponentially more difficult in the last couple of years, but steering people and grounding people in facts and data is always going to be the silver bullet here. We've got another comment that's come in. Let's see, following John's comment on, hey, if you see something in me, let me know. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better. Could we explore steps that a recipient of or an observer of biases can take? Just like Jennifer's colleagues came to her, I have a responsibility to do that. But having somebody come to me and say, you know, this is where the interpersonal piece comes in. This is where the trust piece comes in. This is where the tone at the top, the tone that leaders set begins to sort of have an effect here. But you know, if you're in an organization that is hierarchical and we don't speak truth to power, that becomes bad for a bunch of other reasons. But it's bad sort of in this context as well, because you know, some of you probably have read the Carol Zwick piece, that talks about having a more a growth mindset, a more expansive mindset, a view of, you know, I am a sponge and always sort of a student of the world, attempting to learn more about what I see. But I think it, you know, the reality is I don't think a redirecting conversation about bias is kind of the first thing you get to say to somebody. But as trusted colleague relationships are built, and as trust is built, that people can come forward with things. Again, you know, and Jennifer will tell you, in the investigative space, one of the things we always ask is, you know, when the company says that they protect people from retaliation, do you believe them?
Yep.
There are a lot of folks that say, no, I don't. I saw it's in the policy. I don't believe that. So imagine what that means for the young person at the end of the table who has been on the receiving end of some microaggression or some other sort of, you know, not well thought out biased comment, and what that person's comfort level is going to be bringing that to the team leader or somebody else on the team. You've got to cultivate that culture in order to be able to have those conversations.
I think that's exactly right. And, you know, more specifically, I think one of the things that we've tried to do here and in my prior organizations is, even if you don't have that trust built, trying to state your intention and going into the conversation on both sides with an assumption of positive intent, right? That there's a desire here to try to make things better, to try to flag something or create awareness, and to help the situation as opposed to hinder it, or call it out. I think sometimes what I've seen, and again, in my role, my day job, right, is you get this natural defensiveness that comes up. Well, you're accusing me. Well, I'm not racist. I'm not. And, you know, we jump to this position of like, holy smokes, how did we get there? I just wanted to point out, you know, one thing. And if we could all, if there's 3 words, you know, part of the key takeaways, you know, it's just assume positive intent when folks are trying to have the conversation, when they're being told to me. And I think that's why my colleagues, rightly or wrongly, do feel so open to come to me, is because I've tried to create that culture from a leadership perspective of, this is a two-way street. I'm happy to give you feedback. You guys have to give it to me as well, so that we can, you know, operate in harmony. But it's always the underlying assumption is that we're assuming positive intent. You know, until going to John's very good point on the fact base, right? Until you learn differently, until you understand that perhaps there's something else.
Right. You know, yeah, we don't prejudge the outcome of an investigation or an inquiry. We don't sort of designate people bad guys and good guys. We hear all the facts, and then we make some rigorous sort of judgments on whether things are substantiated or not, or whatever else. But it's a great point of distinction, Jennifer, because people immediately jump to, I mean, and we've created this sort of trigger where people believe that introducing these conversations are somehow an accusation that the speaker was somehow racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever the ist is, that's the case. And the truth is, when we're able to talk about these as sort of biases that have not yet manifest, we can talk to people about sort of a broadened educational lens, a broadened exposure lens, as opposed to one where people have harbored bad intent. It is a nuance, but it's a critical sort of distinction between how we used to have. You remember the 20th century diversity conversations were about good guys and bad guys. You know, we beat up on white guys mercilessly. But, you know, and the white guy knew if he was coming to a D&I conversation that, you know, that he was what was for dinner. So what we have to do now is we have to really talk about this more in terms of capability enablement on teams. We have to talk about this more of, that well-engaged teams are high-performing teams, and that if we leverage everybody's talent, we get a better outcome. That's really what the 21st century conversation about this has happened. But to do that, we have to sort of strip away these blinders that we have about these bias questions. So Naomi, Jennifer, anything else here, or are we ready to move on?
Let's move on.
All right, Kasha, let's go. So analysis. So you've gotten through awareness, and you've concluded that there's some decisions, that there's some concrete steps, actionable steps that need to be taken. The question now is, how do we engage in a thoughtful analysis about what the prescriptive response will be. Are we prescribing the right drug for the right disease? And so we go through these instances. Sometimes they are structural, as the example I gave about, just a wise old sort of thought leader in this area once told me was that, people talk constantly about culture change, but you can't change a culture until you put a name on it, until you identify the attributes of what the culture is. And so that requires some analysis, and we've had those conversations at the firm. What is the cultural sort of fingerprint of the firm? What does that look like? How do we know we're here versus another firm? How do we know we're at this company versus another company? And if you interrogate those things, what you begin to do, and as you talk to people and as you look at practices and procedures, you begin this process of analysis that allows you to sort of frame and name the culture and all of its sort of antecedents, and how it manifests in policy and leadership style and all of these other things as a way of kind of rooting out. Again, the example that I gave from my old company about these talent reviews, Jennifer talked about it. There's a bias called horns and halos that folks talk about. And the horns and halos bias is basically John's up for a promotion and somebody throws out on the table, well, I heard that John's not really prompt at returning client calls. Well, tell us more about that. When was the last time that, well, John was counseled about this? Well, when was John counseled about this? Well, 8 years ago. And having been counseled about it, has there been an issue with John returning clients' calls since? Well, no. So again, taking a blanket assertion, sort of digging in behind it, because these things, and we've all seen these happen in organizations where a talk track, it's kind of like a game of telephone, where a talk track kind of takes on a life of its own. I mean, Jennifer, I also love the school example because teachers talk about this dynamic. When the 6th grade teacher asked the 5th grade teacher, okay, just so that I got the lay of the land, tell me who the smart kids are. And sadly, having been one of those smart kids, what that made me was a lazy 6th grader. Because I had every benefit of the doubt, I had every halo that sort of preceded me as I moved to the next grade. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I imagined that there was some kid busting his behind who had been sort of labeled otherwise, who now has to overcome these biases that teachers, not in any sinister way, but that they just passed from one spot to the other. So interrogating an organization and rooting it out is requires this level of analysis, to look at structures, to ask yourself every time there's a new policy or a new procedure or a new initiative, where are the opportunities in this document, in this plan for bias to creep in? Where is the subjectivity? Where are we asking people to make kind of, less data-driven decisions here? And if we do that, then we're able, again, not to short circuit the plan, but we're then able to say, let's be proactive. Here are the places where we've just got to be really careful that that we've not allowed bias to sort of contaminate the process here.
So, John, I think that speaks directly to the E in DE&I, the equity piece. Because that's kind of the part that we aren't as familiar with. We don't really know what it is, because we have to find these barriers. We have to use that data, find these barriers and remove them so that marginalized groups will experience fair treatment in the workplace, right? And, usually if it's something that isn't personal to you, you have a harder time seeing it as a barrier. And I just want to give a short example. I happened on something called being a bias interrupter. And I'll explain that because the first time I did it, I was an unwitting bias interrupter. I was on a committee, we were reviewing, this is when I was a faculty at West Point, we were reviewing packets of the military faculty that we were going to give invitations to apply to graduate school, get their degrees, and then come to West Point to teach in our department. And I was the only woman in the room, by the way, but the head of the committee had asked me to be there because he knew I would do this, even though I was unwitting about this. We'd reviewed all the packets, and there was one Black woman that had applied. And we were talking about her records specifically. She had mediocre grades when she went through West Point herself. Her test scores met the eligibility criteria, but they weren't, she wasn't blowing it out of the water with the GRE. And I started hearing things from some of my colleagues about, well, is she really going to make it through graduate school? Now, I was very aware that there was also a legacy in the military from segregation and pre-segregation and from when the Army was integrated, that this idea that Black people aren't as smart as white people. And so I was hearing that, but I didn't want to call that out and alienate my colleagues by saying you're being racist, because I think that's what was happening. What I said instead was, but look at her record. She met the eligibility criteria. That's a non-issue. If you looked at her officer evaluations, which we had copies of, she was an outstanding officer. And so what I said was, this is a late bloomer. She may have gotten mediocre grades in college, but look at her performance since then. She's a late bloomer, and she has the strength of will that if that's how she has to get through graduate school, she will still do it, because this is a person who does the best and exceeds expectations at every level. And we invited her to apply to graduate school and to later join the faculty, because I reset their thinking in that moment by being able to analyze the entire picture and get them past, oh, her grades aren't as good as maybe mine were when I was in college.
Right. No, it's another bias, right? It's the bias that says that the things that I'm the best at are the things that are most important to consider.
Absolutely.
When we know is that, that in an ecosystem, some people are brief writers, some people are trial lawyers, some people are business developers, and very few people are all of them. Decision maker bias. Yeah. Jennifer?
Naomi, that's a great example. I was going a very similar one, but is in our job descriptions, right? Or our job requisitions that we post, like how many times have we seen statements like high energy? You want a high energy person that can kind of come in, right? And who's being excluded from that? Perhaps those with low energy or those that are introverted, right? And that don't have that kind of, we tend to like include these terms that we think are very, even top law school, right? What does top law school mean for folks, and how does that impact kind of an entire segment of population? If we are talking about the history of law school and how Black and brown people have matriculated to schools or entered schools and then matriculated from them, like you're missing out on a whole population of folks by using two words that again or two phrases that seem very innocuous, kind of like that, there could be no bias in that. But when you use words like high energy or a top, law school, it causes individuals, I think, to select out from applying, and you could be missing the opportunity to have a really great candidate in your ranks, or creates a scenario where folks are looking at a job requisition and then interviewing a candidate and then looking at that criteria and saying, well, they're not here. And it goes to, I know, John, you and Naomi, both of you have talked about this extensively, but about cultural fit, right? And what that means. And it's just so loaded, but it's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic.
Right. No, we can
analyze and dig deeper. Yeah.
We could do a whole 90 minutes on the fit question as a manifestation of cultural bias. First of all, what does fit mean? Fit probably means like me. It probably is an affinity bias. John seems to be well credentialed, but I just don't know if he would be a fit here. I don't know if he'd be happy here. And these are the things, hopefully after this conference, these are the things we hear in the workplace every day. Every day we hear people talking about these subjective factors that don't have much to do, or like the subjectivity of to Jennifer's point about top law schools. What's a top law school? Well, my law school is a top law school. or, you know, kind of what does that matter? There was a great study done by the Minority Corporate Counsel Association that some of you are aware of that was called The Myth of Meritocracy. And what it did was it sort of tore apart the bios of, I think, 1,500 big law partners who by every objective standard had been successful in practice, you know, top of the heap, top of the order. And then it looked at where they went to law school and who was on the law review and who had a clerkship, and concluded ultimately that there wasn't really a correlation between sort of, you know, that there were some intangibles, obviously, that there was in the same example that Naomi gave, that there are intangibles that begin to inform who's likely to be successful. And it's not just the criteria that we have that we've determined. We're having that conversation in my firm now, which I'm pleased and proud. We're having I work and sit on a dotted line on our associates committee and also on our search committee, and we're going to some different schools. We're really thinking about talent in a different way, particularly taking into account things like the fact that people may be first-generation college graduates or first-generation law students, and trying to figure out how we, you know, how we create some equivalency in those dimensions rather than sort of the same dimensions that we have always used. But good. Let's move on to the next slide. See if there's anything else coming up in the box there. I also think that demonstrating that you're a leader who's open to criticism frees the team to realize that they have room to grow. Absolutely right. Couldn't agree more. I mean, the best, I think, most actualized leaders that I have seen are obviously always intentionally on the hunt for feedback. Because of course, what's the one thing that you can never be as a senior leader is oblivious. You can never be out of the loop. You can never be in a position where you don't really know what your folks actually think, or worse, have communicated either implicitly or explicitly that nobody can bring you bad news. Leaders who are going to naturally excel at this are the ones that are open to that feedback, have dropped the hierarchy. We started a program at the company that was reverse mentoring. We'd taken millennials from around the company and we had paired them with C-suite folks. And the head of global communications heard from a 23-year-old person in finance that the way that the company wrote EOMs and press releases was kind of corny. And there was a lot of throat clearing and why don't you just get to the point, and people don't want to, everybody knows you jump to the third paragraph because the first two paragraphs are just some corporate throat clearing. If you're open to feedback, then you'll get some good, rich feedback from folks that will invariably make you a more inspired leader and invariably make folks feel like they're in a more engaged environment.
Hey, John, as you're going into the planning discussion, there was a comment embedded somewhere, I don't know where it is, but about sharing our thoughts on how to introduce accountability partners programmatically.
Sure.
I think that might be a nice one to address here, but just as you're discussing this one.
Okay. So how to introduce the accountability partners. So the planning, again, you know, using my example of the workplace investigation, obviously most of what we do as lawyers is by its nature reactive, particularly if you do litigation. It's, you know, you're minding your own business and somebody has sued your company, and now you have got to do this simultaneous forensic exercise to figure out whether there's something there, whether there's a there. But you've also got to begin to kind of mount a defense and begin to kind of, after the fact, justify whatever it is that has happened or has not happened. That's how we deal with these, you know, with these instances of bias. Again, it's usually, you know, gotten to a place where people are disengaged, whoever that person is, folks are leaving the firm, leaving the company, because they believe that in the face of what they view to be an obvious set of biases and stonewalls, that the company didn't do anything to stop it. So planning really sort of shifts that dynamic on its head and allows us to be more proactive and more thoughtful about how we root out bias and how we talk about it. So the question is how you do that. How do you act proactively? How do you create a culture? I mean, again, we've all done it. And I mean, Jennifer, in our compliance worlds, you know, we tell people, you see something, say something, or remind them of affirmative duties to report wrongdoing when they see it. But how do you get people kind of thinking about in this area, really being preemptive about addressing bias in real time when it comes up? Naomi, you want to start us off there?
Sure. First, I would say that I think, you know, some of what you and Jennifer have already touched on about having a culture that's open to hearing critiques and is inclusive of other people actually gets you down the road with the planning piece. Because people can say something when they do see something and they feel supported in doing so. And I would also say it's about allyship. You know, it's sometimes it's easier to stand up for somebody else than to stand up for ourselves. And when you see something happening in the moment, the victim of, say, a microaggression may be, you know, experiencing shock and they don't know what to do, but you as a bystander can intercede on their behalf, or at least just look at them and say, are you okay? Right? And to kind of intervene in that moment. But I would also say that on an organizational level, that you have to build bias mitigation into the system. You know, we're all supposed to be doing our self-reflection and education and contact with other groups and getting out of our bubble. But if you build it into the system, then you can also mitigate the bias of the people who aren't doing that. You know, we need to operationalize the, you know, the bias mitigation as much as possible. You know, and that requires both quantitative data and the qualitative data that can help us identify those barriers that people are experiencing. You know, and John, you mentioned someone, you know, may have hit all these walls and they're about to leave the company. Well, if there had been like stay interviews being conducted with that person along their career path to make sure they weren't experiencing barriers, to make sure they were getting the professional development that they needed to be able to progress in the company, then maybe that could have been avoided. So that's one of those, you know, formal things that you can do to mitigate bias is a stay interview. You know, something else, just in the recruiting and hiring process, you know, Jennifer, you talked about not having academic snobbery and putting things into, you know, job descriptions that turn off a group of people. But it's also, you know, redacting names from resumes because multicultural names don't get as many callbacks for interviews as European sounding names. And so there are little things like that that you can put into the system to mitigate the bias of, you know, without having to depend solely on people to do it in and of themselves.
Jennifer?
I would just, you know, I think that's exactly right. It's great advice. And creating that safe space, and, you know, as we're thinking about how to create those accountability partners, but, you know, you have the team work that you have as a leader and developing that. And then within that team or that infrastructure, perhaps it's a colleague, like a lateral colleague of yours that you could reach out to hold you accountable and to make the ask. Again, if we are all trying to, you know, we're all in this together, we're all trying to achieve, you know, the best result for the company, for ourselves, for our team. We all work many long hours, and you want to work in an environment where you feel valued, where you feel heard. And taking that step to just ask the question, I think in the first instance is probably the hardest one, particularly for those, you know, John, you started the conversation about, or at some point about the, you know, our white colleagues maybe feeling, you know, the ones back in the day where the conversation was going to be about them, right? And it's not really about race. It's not really about gender. It's really about valuing everyone's individual contribution and trying to create an infrastructure that does that, taking out kind of maybe the more inflammatory, you know, portions of it when we're looking at implicit bias versus explicit bias.
No, it's a great point, and we now have a lot of data that tells us. I mean, the McKinsey work, the Deloitte work, that tells us empirically that diverse teams are higher performing. So it's not a racial lens, because diversity is not just race and ethnicity. It is demographic diversity. It is generational diversity. All of the, it's gender diversity, the great stuff that shows, the differential with diverse, gender diverse corporate boards. There's just a whole tranche of stuff now, I think, that arms a person that wants to have this conversation in their workplace, would say, look, this is not just a cultural, this was the Karen Tornak comment. This is not just a cultural nice to have. This is how we are better at the work that we do. And this is how we kind of exceed in that work. But there were a lot of great things. Let me come back, Naomi, to the to this idea of sort of the deduping of names. That's been a big topic. I know the New York Times did a piece earlier this year about the fact that that candidates with ethnic sounding names were anglicizing their names on resumes in order to get more callbacks. And that that unfortunately has sort of been the reality for a lot of for a lot of folks who have surnames. So all of those biases are sort of brought to bear. I think I talked last time about the Thomas Myers piece, the great work that that the consultancy out of Chicago did with the memo from the Black associate and the white associate in the law firm, and asked partners to grade it. And of course, hate to ruin the punchline for you, but the white associate gets scored better than the Black associate. And then what that all says about sort of where we are. I want to go back. There was a question about, and I think this, Naomi, was in response to your last comments about 360 reviews and kind of the pros and cons of 360s as a way to maybe get leaders closer to this feedback.
Actually, the latest research I've seen on 360 reviews shows that they're very bad from a gender bias standpoint. And this is whether you're doing student evaluations of teachers, or whether you're doing the 360 where you have peers, superiors and subordinates all review the same person, that it just opens up the can of worms for gender bias to enter into that system. So I would say the jury is still out on the 360 reviews right now.
Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. I understand we're probably inside of 10 minutes. I want to make sure at least we sort of introduce all these concepts. So the last step is action. And I think we've covered a lot of this, what actions, processes, cultural change, accountabilities have to be put in place to root out, call out, or remediate the bias. I think we've touched on that in different dimensions. We talked about some of the programmatic, some of the programmatic interventions, but a lot of this. I mean, I was always, when I did the diversity work as a full-time job, I was always known to repeat that, we will reach an end of our ability to leverage programmatic interventions to fix this. We can always launch a new mentoring program. We can always launch a new sort of, scared, I called them kind of the corporate scared straight programs, where you brought somebody in and they sort of gave you the whole, gloom and doom about, if you don't get better, this is going to happen. But I think this is just a lot of interpersonal. A lot of this really depends upon the relationships that we make. And the efforts that we make to get to know each other at a personal level, and a comfort level we give each other. What to stop doing. I think a lot of our processes, to Naomi's point, without intending to, have introduced some bias into how we think about talent, how we think about opportunity, about how we think about workflow. And just even the benefits of the doubt that we give each other. Years ago, I was in a session with one of our leaders who was speaking to one of these sort of civic engagement kind of leadership Atlanta pieces, and he was asked. This guy was number 2, 3 guy in the company, and he was asked, what do you believe was the difference in your career trajectory? How'd you get here? And this was, a 40-ish corporate kind of square-jawed white guy. And I never forgot his answer. His answer was, I guess when I think about it, at critical junctures in my career, I was trusted with jobs that I wasn't quite ready for. And I won't speak for my fellow panelists, but I don't know if I've ever heard a woman say that. And I've never heard a person of color say that. So there are benefits of the doubt. There are presumptions. There are all of these things that kind of begin to kind of roll up and inform how people look at kind of taking it, and who we repose confidence in when we're trying to think about what these are. And the tone at the top, very, very significant. I mean, we've seen, we've seen some moves from senior leaders, from general counsel, who have placed a talented but still not quite ready for the big job person in role, and have allowed some opportunity for experimentation and even some opportunity for mistakes. Either you guys have anything to add here?
I don't know that I think you put it well put. I was looking through my talking points and I think you covered most of them. Maybe in the interest of time, we should move on to the
Okay.
next one so that we can finish up.
Fair enough. Yeah, we've got 2 slides left. So we got, so let's go to ongoing. Ongoing assessment again. This is the notion that this is a process, not an event. This is also the notion that this is a practice. This is not anything that any of us will sort of master in time. But how do we drive, sustainability has always been the question in D&I conversations. How does this survive beyond a particular leader? How does this survive beyond a particular event? How do you continue to keep without in service to some bad outcome? How do we continue to drive this forward? And how do we create? We talked about the early warning tools. We talked about modifications, but all of this does cascade from the top of your organization, because people watch what leaders do. People follow even more intently than their words. I mean, Coke was a very conservative culture. So as recently as the last 10 years, men were still wearing suits to work. And then the company went business casual. And all the men did was took off their ties. So still, because, and I asked one of my colleagues, he says, because when I go upstairs, they're all still wearing suits. So what messages and what symbols the leadership of an organization gives becomes very important, and it's additional burden of leadership to kind of think about how you drive that. So recognizing that there's subjectivity that will creep in, but do not underestimate in my experience the sheer power of the words that you may or may not be able to get to come out of your leaders' mouths about a culture of openness, a culture where everybody can be successful, a culture where we're intentionally rooting out bias, a culture where we want to hear your feedback about how things are going. We in particular want to hear, as lawyers that do this kind of work, we used to always say that we know that there are issues. We know that there are people with concerns. We know that there are people out there that are feeling, as my sister would say, some kind of way. And the object is to keep those people inside the building, right? Not have them at the media, not have them, going to lawyers, but really making people know that there's an opportunity within the building to be heard. So we wrap up. Key takeaways, just kind of a summary of kind of where we've been. Biases are a deviation from rationality. So I think the most compelling thing, particularly given, the rational DNA that we sort of enjoy professionally as lawyers, to point out the obvious, that you're not operating on data. You're not operating from a rational vantage point. You are operating from a place that is visceral and that is intuitive. And while that works in some things, that doesn't work here. That debiasing is an event, that it's not an event, it's a process, and that it's a practice that we all have to get better at. This is not a crash diet. This is to get ready for something. This is just a kind of a way of doing. And we have to kind of understand where bias comes from. We have to understand where our own biases come from. We've inherited a lot from our grandparents and great grandparents, but we've inherited biases. Some of them were designed to sort of keep us safe. The distrust that was sort of poured into me as a young person about white people was a matter of survival for my grandparents and parents who grew up in a Jim Crow society. So it's not to blame what we've had poured into us, but it's to recognize and to realize that it begins to kind of color how we interact in the world. And then finally, as I said, as leaders, we all set the tone for this. And I think if leaders begin to adopt this more growth mindset and begin to sort of lean into these questions, I think we can make a lot of progress. I believe that is the last slide. The last link, I think you all will get this, is an article for further reading by Effectiology, which I think is a psychology think tank that talks about biases. And the article is linked there, but it gives you the smorgasbord of every kind of bias that's out there, and a little bit of analytics about kind of where they are and how we get rid of them. But with that, I think that unless Naomi or Jennifer have anything else, I think we'll pass it back to Veronique.
All right. At this point, we must conclude today's roundtable. On behalf of our chapter, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our sponsor, Shook, Hardy & Bacon, and to John Lewis, Naomi Mercer, and Jennifer Roberts for leading this discussion and providing this important insight. While we had hoped to host this event in person, we are thrilled that we were able to gather virtually, and we hope you will contact Shook if you have any additional questions they can address. I'd like to take a quick moment to encourage everyone to sign up for the ACC NCR Racial and Social Justice Challenge, and to ask for support for the ACC NCR Racial and Social Justice fundraising campaign to benefit the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. This challenge is an opportunity for you to expand your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and to fight for racial and social justice within your communities. To find out more about the challenge, go to the ACC NCR LinkedIn page for details. Also, Stephanie, I think, has posted the link for registration and donations in the Q&A box. Join us in the fight for racial and social justice. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. This was a very good discussion and very insightful. Thank you for your time.